The onlookers observed in shocked silence. However, this situation wasn't driven by romance, nor was it about making a choice. This concerned staying alive. 3 months before this moment, Ezekiel Marsh had been an entirely different person. The dry spell had destroyed his livestock. The financial institution was threatening to seize his property, and the medical expenses from his deceased wife's illness were crushing him like a trap. He found himself in Sterling Maddox's office, staring at documents that would erase everything his ancestors had created while holding papers in his battered hands. "I have an offer for you," Sterling announced, his chubby face shining with perspiration despite the crisp morning weather. "My child Magnolia requires a spouse. Miss Willa Blaine also requires one, because her father owed me a lot before he died." Ezekiel's breathing became difficult. He had observed both women in the neighborhood. Magnolia seldom ventured from her father's shop, constantly concealed behind the sales counter. Willa resided by herself on her inherited property, maintaining her privacy. Both women carried additional weight that caused other men to avert their eyes while making harsh comments behind their backs. Sterling continued by pushing a document across the polished wooden desk. "You will wed both of them. You will grant these ladies the honor of marriage. I will cancel your obligations, and I will provide you with funding for the upcoming season. Everyone benefits from this." The proposition struck Ezekiel like a punch to the body. He got married to 2 women he barely knew, women whom the community had dismissed as impossible to marry. His dignity protested, yet his empty belly and the seizure notice in his pocket spoke with greater volume. "Is this permitted by law?" Ezekiel inquired, barely audible in his inquiry. "Regional legislation permits it under certain conditions. I have made all the arrangements," Sterling replied with a smile as frigid as winter metal. "You must decide before the sun sets. Following that, the financial institution will claim your property tomorrow." Ezekiel stepped into the scorching midday heat, his thoughts whirling. The community's primary road extended ahead of him like a challenge. Mrs. Henderson was sweeping her front steps, observing him with the expression she used for injured creatures. 2 ranch hands relaxed outside the tavern, their amusement piercing the atmosphere as they spoke about his situation. The burden of their criticism weighed heavily on his shoulders. Everyone was aware of his financial troubles and desperation. They expected to see how far down he would go. Yet as he walked past Maddox's shop, he caught sight of Magnolia through the glass. She was organizing fabric rolls with meticulous care, her actions elegant despite her build. For a brief instant, their gazes connected, and he observed something there that caught him off guard. A silent tenacity that brought to mind Mountain Stone, not shame or defeat. That night, as darkness extended across the dusty road, Ezekiel put his signature on the document. However, he was unaware that both women held secrets that would alter his perceptions of marriage, honor, and partnership's true significance. The marriage ceremony was scheduled for the next week, providing Ezekiel with insufficient time to fully grasp what he had committed to. Yet Sterling Maddox was someone who acted quickly when finances were at stake, and he had already informed the community that his daughter would finally be wed. Ezekiel used those days to avoid the inquisitive looks and hushed discussions that pursued him everywhere. Upon entering the general store for provisions, conversations halted abruptly. Young ones pointed until their parents pulled them away. The burden of their criticism felt more oppressive than the debt that had forced him into this desperate decision. On Wednesday, he met Magnolia by herself in her father's establishment. She was tallying stock, her substantial fingers operating with unexpected skill as she documented figures in a bound leather journal. When she became aware of his presence, she didn't look away as most people anticipated her to do. "You are not obligated to proceed with this," she spoke softly, keeping her eyes on her task. "I informed my father that I had no need for his charitable arrangements." Ezekiel looked at her from the side. She possessed intelligent eyes and gentle brown hair that reflected the sunlight coming through the glass. There was honor in her posture, despite the circumstances. He surprised himself by responding, "Perhaps I am the recipient of charity." She looked up at that moment, studying his expression for signs of ridicule. When she discovered none, something changed in her demeanor. "Father claims you possess a fine ranch. quality land that holds more worth than what most men contribute to a marriage nowadays. Willa Blaine entered the room as soon as the doorbell rang, before he could respond. She stood taller than Magnolia with remarkable green eyes and reddish-brown hair woven down her back. Unlike Magnolia, who dressed for practicality, Willa wore a worn but expertly fitted dress that hinted at more prosperous times. Until Willa spoke, the three of them maintained an uncomfortable silence. "I believe we should address the arrangements. This circumstance is sufficiently unusual without introducing unnecessary bewilderment." Her speech retained traces of education, the type acquired from literature and formal instruction. Ezekiel pondered what events had led her to accept Sterling's offer. "I possess my own dwelling on my father's former property," Willa continued. "I can preserve my autonomy there. This union is a commercial agreement, nothing beyond that." Magnolia gave a slow nod. "Father has arranged quarters above the shop. I can remain there and assist with his enterprise." Ezekiel experienced an odd sense of disappointment at their businesslike words. He had anticipated this to be entirely transactional, yet hearing them speak about it so practically created an empty feeling in his chest. "What about the ranch?" he asked. "It's sufficiently large for a household if anyone desired it." "We do not constitute a household," Willa interjected, her tone cutting. "We are three individuals connected by legal papers and financial requirements. Let us avoid pretending otherwise." Yet as she spoke, Ezekiel observed her hands shaking slightly, and he questioned whether her harsh statements were intended to persuade him or herself. Something indicated there was more to both these women than their carefully built barriers showed. The wedding was merely 4 days away, and he already sensed that nothing regarding this arrangement would be as straightforward as Sterling Maddox had indicated. The wedding morning arrived with unusual cold and overcast skies that appeared to reflect everyone's mood involved. Ezekiel stood before his damaged mirror, straightening his only fine shirt and questioning how his existence had brought him to this point. The ceremony would occur in a small chapel at the town's edge, with Reverend Walsh conducting the uncommon service. Sterling had demanded making a community event, asserting it would validate the arrangement and prevent any legal disputes. Later, as Ezekiel approached the church, he observed groups of residents collecting along the road. Some watched with obvious interest, others with barely hidden entertainment. Several women expressed disapproval by shaking their heads, though he couldn't determine whether they disapproved of him or the brides. Within the church, the environment was dense with strain. Sterling Maddox occupied the front bench, dressed in his finest clothing, and displaying the pleased expression of someone who had resolved a complicated business issue. Behind him, the church was more crowded than it had been for any service in recent months. Magnolia, dressed in a plain blue gown that her mother had previously worn, arrived first. She proceeded with quiet elegance down the center aisle, her head held up despite the whispers that accompanied her. Upon reaching the altar, she offered Ezekiel a slight acknowledgement that seemed to communicate they faced this together, regardless of what it might bring. Willa followed, and Ezekiel stopped breathing. She had transformed herself for this event, wearing a rich green dress that enhanced her eyes and auburn hair. Despite the group's stares and whispered comments, she carried herself with the dignity of a noble woman, keeping her spine straight and her attention directed in that direction. Reverend Walsh nervously cleared his throat as both women positioned themselves next to Ezekiel. The elderly minister had obviously never conducted a ceremony like this, and he struggled with his prayer book while beginning the service. "Beloved friends," he started, his voice slightly breaking, "we have assembled today to observe the joining of Ezekiel Marsh to Magnolia Maddox and Willa Blaine in matrimonial bonds." A whisper spread through the assembly. When others turned to look disapprovingly, someone in the back pews chuckled and quickly stopped. Ezekiel felt a surge of warmth in his face, but when he looked at his brides, both of them remained remarkably calm. As the ceremony continued, Ezekiel found himself examining both women's expressions. Magnolia exuded a calm, almost tranquil demeanor, as if she had found inner peace regarding the situation. Willa, however, seemed to be engaged in some internal struggle. Her jaw tightened and her hands gripped so firmly her knuckles had become pale. Reverend Walsh clearly was unsure of how to modify traditional vows for such an unconventional arrangement, when the time came for promises. In the resonant church, they agreed on brief declarations of dedication and consideration that appeared empty. But something unexpected happened as Ezekiel spoke his promises and looked first at Willa and then at Magnolia. He felt a fierce protective instinct rise in his chest as he stood before the entire community that had criticized them all. By agreeing to share their lives, a man they barely knew rather than being treated with sympathy and contempt, these women had shown greater bravery than anyone else seated in those benches. "You may kiss the brides," Reverend Walsh declared, his voice barely audible. The church stopped talking. This was the moment everyone had anticipated, the display they had come to observe. Ezekiel turned to Magnolia first, placing a tender kiss on her cheek. She smiled gently, her eyes filled with appreciation. Then he turned to Willa, expecting the same formal gesture. However, when his lips touched her cheek, she recoiled as if struck, and for just a moment, he witnessed raw anguish flash across her features before she regained her composure. As they faced the assembly as husband and wives, Ezekiel understood that regardless of what difficulties lay ahead, the most challenging part wasn't the unusual arrangement itself. It was the secrets both women were harboring, secrets that could either unite them or destroy their delicate new household. The celebration occurred in Sterling's store, hastily emptied of goods to accommodate tables and chairs borrowed from the church. The mood was tense with most attendees present out of interest rather than joy. Ezekiel observed his new wives handle the awkward discussions and barely hidden stares with remarkable grace. Magnolia moved through the small gathering with experienced ease. Having spent years managing her father's clientele, she distributed cake and served coffee, performing as the ideal hostess despite the situation. Several town women actually engaged her in sincere conversation, appearing to recognize her as a person rather than a spectacle for the first time. Willa, however, stayed on the edges, her refined demeanor creating an unseen barrier that few attempted to cross. When elderly Mrs. Patterson approached with what seemed to be well-intentioned marriage advice, Willa's courteous but definitive responses quickly concluded the discussion. As the afternoon progressed, Ezekiel found himself observing both women with increasing interest. There were aspects to each of them that contradicted his original assumptions. Magnolia's quiet self-assurance suggested depths he hadn't anticipated, while Willa's careful restraint implied weaknesses she was determined to conceal. Near evening, the final guests left, leaving the three of them to clean the remains of their unusual wedding celebration. Sterling had withdrawn to his office, content that his business arrangement was finished. The quiet extended between them as they arranged chairs and collected dishes. "I suppose we should address living arrangements," Willa stated finally, removing her gloves with careful movements. "I was sincere about maintaining my independence." Magnolia nodded, though Ezekiel noticed a brief flash of disappointment cross her features. "Father anticipates me to continue assisting with the store. I can stay in the rooms upstairs." Ezekiel felt unexpected irritation building in his chest. "So, we are married only in title, 3 distinct existences that share legal documents. What did you anticipate?" Willa's voice carried a sharp edge. "Love notes, evening walks, and romance? This was a business deal, nothing more." Yet as she spoke, her hands trembled slightly, and Ezekiel detected something in her tone that suggested her harsh words were demanding something from her. "I anticipated honesty at minimum," he replied quietly. "Regardless of what brought each of us to this point, we are now connected. We can make the most of it or allow pride to ruin any opportunity of finding something valuable." Magnolia looked up from the dishes she was cleaning. "What proposal do you have?" "Come to the ranch, both of you, for dinner tomorrow evening. Let us attempt to be something more than strangers who happen to share a surname." Willa stood up straight, her green eyes shining. "I do not need charitable dinners or forced companionships." "Neither do I," Ezekiel said, meeting her gaze directly. "But I do need to understand the people I am legally connected to. And despite what you might believe, I suspect you both need the same thing." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Magnolia dried her hands on her apron, glancing between them. "I will attend," she said softly, "if Willa consents." All attention turned to Willa who stood frozen in internal conflict. Her carefully built walls were showing fractures, and Ezekiel could observe the battle between her pride and something deeper occurring across her features. "Very well," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "One dinner, but do not expect miracles." As they separated that evening, each heading to their individual residences, Ezekiel wondered what tomorrow would deliver. He had a feeling that beneath the surface of this practical arrangement lay currents that could either drown them all or carry them towards something none of them had dared to hope for. The following day, Ezekiel put in more effort than he had in any other meal since the death of his first wife to prepare dinner. He cleaned the ranch house completely, arranged wildflowers in a glass jar, and prepared a simple but filling meal of beef stew and fresh bread. As evening neared, his nervousness surprised him. Magnolia arrived first, bringing a covered dish and wearing a clean apron over her regular dress. She paused at the entrance, taking in the humble but well-kept home. "It's beautiful," she said, and he could tell she was genuine. "You have maintained it very well." "My late wife Sarah had firm beliefs about housekeeping," Ezekiel replied, accepting the dish she offered. "Old practices." Magnolia's expression grew tender. How long had she been gone? 2 years this autumn. The fever claimed her quickly. The words still came with difficulty, but somehow telling Magnolia felt natural. "She would have appreciated you. I believe you have her way of making things feel calm." Before Magnolia could respond, they heard the sound of an approaching horse. Willa rode up on a stunning chestnut mare, sitting her saddle with a kind of expertise that indicated years of riding. She had changed from her wedding dress into practical riding attire, but she still maintained that unmistakable dignity. As he assisted her in dismounting, Ezekiel said, "I was uncertain you'd come." "So was I," Willa confessed, her honesty surprising them both. The dinner began awkwardly with forced conversation about the weather and ranch matters. However, as the evening advanced and the wine Willa had brought relaxed their tongues, genuine discussion began to develop. Willa told Ezekiel about her journey to the ranch. "You ride as if you were raised in the saddle," he said. She replied, a shadow crossing her face. "My father demanded I learn everything about ranch operations. He said a woman who possessed land needed to comprehend every element of it." "Possessed?" Magnolia inquired subtly. Willa hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. "My father left me 300 acres and significant debt. When he died last year, I learned he had borrowed extensively against the property. Sterling Maddox held most of those debts." The pieces began connecting for Ezekiel. "So, this marriage reserves my land and eliminates my debt just as it saved your ranch." Willa's voice was factual, but her hands tightened around her wine glass. "We are both results of financial desperation. Let us not pretend otherwise." Magnolia had become quiet during this conversation, and when they both looked at her expectantly, she seemed to withdraw into herself. "What about you?" Ezekiel asked gently. "What led you to accept your father's arrangement?" Magnolia's cheeks reddened, and she looked down at her hands. "You would not comprehend." "Attempt to tell us," Willa said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "I am 28 years old," Magnolia said quietly. "I have spent my entire existence behind the counter of my father's store, observing other women marry and create families while men look right past me. Father claims no man would select me willingly, that my only worth is in the dowry he can offer." The raw anguish in her voice struck Ezekiel like a physical blow. He saw Willa's expression soften as well. Understanding passed between the two women. Willa said with firmness, "Your father is a fool. Any man who cannot see beyond the surface does not deserve what you have to give." Magnolia looked up in surprise, tears shining in her eyes. "You truly believe that?" "I do." Willa reached across the table and took Magnolia's hand. "We have all been judged by appearances and deemed inadequate. Perhaps it is time we stopped accepting other people's assessments of our value." Ezekiel watched this exchange with growing wonder. These women, whom the town had dismissed as unmarriageable burdens, were revealing themselves to be complex, intelligent, and infinitely more valuable than the shallow judgments placed upon them. As the evening concluded, a comfortable silence settled over the three of them. For the first time since signing Sterling's contract, Ezekiel began to wonder if this arrangement might become something more than mere survival. However, just as that hope took root, Willa stiffened, her expression closing off again. "Thank you for dinner," she said formally, rising from her chair. "But we should not mistake one pleasant evening for something it is not." As she prepared to leave, Ezekiel could not shake the feeling that Willa was fleeing from something that frightened her more than financial ruin or social judgment. And until he understood what that was, their fragile new bond would remain as precarious as a house built on shifting sand. Over the following weeks, an unexpected routine developed between the three of them. Magnolia would visit the ranch twice weekly, often bringing supplies from her father's store and staying to help with household tasks. Her presence brought a warmth to the place that Ezekiel had not realized he had been missing. Willa remained more distant, but she began stopping by occasionally when her ranch work brought her near his property line. She would have coffee and talk to people, but she would always keep her distance and never stay past sunset. It was during one of these visits that Ezekiel discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about Willa Blaine. He had been repairing fence near the creek when he heard the sound of approaching horses. He saw Willa riding quickly toward his property and looked up. She wasn't the only one, though. 3 men followed close behind, and even from a distance, Ezekiel could see this was not a friendly social call. Willa's mare was covered with sweat as she pulled up near where Ezekiel worked. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set with determination. "Whatever they tell you, do not believe them," she said quickly, glancing back at the approaching riders. The 3 men rode up with the swagger of men accustomed to intimidating others. The leader, a heavy-set man with greasy hair and cold eyes, dismounted and spat in the dust. Well, he said, his voice carrying a nasty undertone. "If it is not Mrs. Marsh, though I suppose I should say one of the Mrs. Marshes, should I not?" Ezekiel stepped protectively closer to Willa, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped against a fence post. "State your business." "Name is Pike. These here are my associates. We are here to get what is owed to us." "I do not owe you anything," Ezekiel replied evenly. Pike's laugh was ugly. "Not you, friend. Her." He pointed a dirty finger at Willa. "See, before she became your respectable wife, Miss Willa here had some debts of her own. Debts that do not just disappear because she found herself a husband." Willa's face had gone completely white, but she held her ground. "I told you before, Pike, I do not have the money. I never had the money." "That is where you are wrong, sweetheart. Your new husband here must have some assets. That is a nice ranch. Good land. Should cover what you owe with interest." Ezekiel felt a cold anger building in his chest. "What exactly does she supposedly owe you?" Pike's grin revealed yellow teeth. "Gambling debts. Your wife here has expensive taste when it comes to card games. Lost big in a game about 6 months back. We have been patient, but patience has its limits." "That is a lie," Willa said, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear. "I never gamble with you or anyone else." "You calling me a liar?" Pike's hand moved to rest on his gun, but "Because I have got witnesses say otherwise. And the law tends to believe men with witnesses over women with stories." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. These men had set a trap, which Ezekiel could see, in a territory where women had few legal protections, and a man's word carried more weight than truth. They could destroy Willa's reputation and claim whatever they wanted. However, as Ezekiel studied Pike's face, he saw something the man probably did not realize he was revealing. This was not about gambling debts or money. This was personal. The way Pike looked at Willa, the hunger in his eyes, told a different story entirely. "Get off my land," Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying a steel edge that made Pike's companions shift nervously in their saddles. Pike's expression hardened. "Marsh will be back, and next time we will bring the sheriff. Think about whether your new wife is worth losing everything you have worked for." As the 3 men rode away, Ezekiel turned to find Willa staring after them with an expression that mixed fear and fury in equal measure. She said, barely making a whisper, "It is not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," Ezekiel replied gently, "because we will face it together, whatever hold they think they have over you." But even as he spoke, he could see Willa withdrawing once more and her walls being rebuilt one stone at a time. Whatever secret she was protecting, it was big enough that she would rather face Pike's threats alone than trust her new husband with the truth. Ezekiel rode to Sterling Maddox's store that evening with more questions than answers in mind. He found Magnolia alone, closing up for the day, her father having retired early with another of his frequent headaches that seemed to coincide with difficult conversations. "I need to ask you about Willa," Ezekiel said without preamble. "What do you know about her past?" Magnolia's hand still on the ledger she was balancing. "Why? What has happened?" Ezekiel told her about Pike's visit and the claims about gambling debts. As he spoke, he watched Magnolia's expression shift from confusion to something that looked like recognition. "Gambling debts," she repeated slowly. "No, that is not right. Willa does not gamble." "But what then?" Magnolia lowered her voice after giving the stairs to her father's quarters a quick glance. "About a year ago, before her father died, there were rumors, talk about Willa and some trouble in the next county over. Father would not tell me the details, said it was not proper for me to know such things." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that makes a woman leave her home in the middle of the night and never speak of where she came from." Magnolia's eyes were troubled. "Father said her father brought her here to start fresh, that whatever happened before was behind them. But if these men have followed her..." Ezekiel felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, none of them forming a picture he liked. "Where can I find out more about what happened?" "Mrs. Patterson may be aware. She keeps track of every scandal that has ever occurred because she has family in every county within 200 miles. Magnolia was hesitant. "But Ezekiel, if you start digging into Willa's past, you might find things that change how you see her." "She is my wife," he said simply. "Whatever she is running from, she does not have to run alone anymore." Ezekiel found Mrs. the following morning, Patterson hanging laundry behind her boarding house. The elderly woman was well known for having a sharp tongue and a better memory, and she had never encountered a piece of gossip that she couldn't elaborate on. "Willa Blaine," she said, pausing with a wet sheet in her hands. "Now there's a name I have not heard spoken aloud in months, though I suppose it is Mrs. Marsh now, is it not? What do you know about her past, Mrs. Patterson?" The old woman's eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of a person who had finally found someone to listen to the information she had been sitting on. "Came from Cedar Ridge County." "She did. Her father owned a big spread over there. Successful man by all accounts. However, something occurred, something that made them pack up and leave everything behind." "What kind of something?" Mrs. Patterson glanced around as if enemies might be listening, then leaned closer. "Word was that she was getting married. Fellow named Marcus Pike. Had money and connections. Big wedding planned. The whole county invited." Ezekiel's blood ran cold. "Pike, the same last name as the man who had threatened them yesterday. What happened to the engagement?" "That is where the stories get interesting." Mrs. Patterson carried on, clearly having a good time. "Some say she ran off with another man the night before the wedding. Others say she killed someone and had to flee. But my cousin Martha, who lived in Cedar Ridge then, she always said the girl looked like she had been through hell when they left town." "Looked how?" Mrs. The seriousness in Patterson's expression grew, like someone who had been hurt bad and was still healing. "Martha said she saw bruises on her arms when she helped load their wagon. Said the girl flinched every time a man came near her." The picture forming in Ezekiel's mind made his stomach turn. A powerful man, a woman who tried to escape, and threats that followed her even after she found refuge in marriage to another. This Marcus Pike. Ezekiel said carefully, "What happened to him?" "Oh, he is still there. Still unmarried. Martha says he never got over being left at the altar. Still talks about Willa like she is his property, like she will come back when she is done playing games." Ezekiel thanked Mrs. With his mind racing, Patterson rode back toward his ranch. The man who threatened them yesterday was not just some criminal looking for easy money. He was a spurned lover who believed he had a claim on Willa. And men like that did not give up easily. As he topped a rise near his property, he saw smoke rising from the direction of Willa's cabin. Not the thin smoke of a cooking fire, but the thick, dark smoke of something burning that should not be. He spurred his horse forward, a cold dread settling in his chest. Ezekiel had not anticipated that they would return so soon, despite Pike's assurance that they would. As he rode hard toward Willa's property, he could only hope he was not already too late. Ezekiel reached Willa's property to find her barn engulfed in flames. However, the cabin remained untouched. He spotted Willa standing in her yard, rifle in hand, facing down Marcus Pike and his two companions, who sat their horses just beyond weapon range. Willa, Ezekiel called out as he dismounted, drawing his own rifle. Pike turned with a cold smile. Well, if it is not the husband, come to collect your property. She is not property, Ezekiel said, moving to stand beside Willa. She is my wife, and you are trespassing. Your wife? Pike laughed harshly. You think some piece of paper changes what she owes me? Willa's voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. I never owed you anything, Marcus. I never said I would marry you, and I won't ever. You left me standing at the altar in front of the whole county. Pike snarled, his facade of calm cracking. Made me look like a fool. Do you know what that cost me? Willa responded, less than what staying would have cost me. And for the first time since Ezekiel had known her, her voice carried no fear, only cold determination. Pike's face became darker. You were always too proud for yourself. But pride does not keep a woman safe when she is all alone. Ezekiel spoke softly. She is not alone. At that moment, he heard approaching hoofbeats and turned to see Magnolia riding up with Sheriff Henderson and 3 deputies. Magnolia had clearly prepared for trouble by acting. The sight of law enforcement seemed to deflate Pike's companions, but Pike himself only smiled wider. Sheriff, he called out, excellent timing. I was just explaining to these folks about the outstanding debts owed to me. Sheriff Henderson, a fair man who had known Ezekiel for years, dismounted slowly. What kind of debts, Pike? Breach of promise, Pike said smoothly. Miss Blaine here was legally engaged to marry me. She damaged my reputation and cost me a significant amount of money in wedding preparations when she fled. I am entitled to compensation. Henderson provided an answer. That is a civil matter. And last I checked, Willa Blaine is now Mrs. Marsh. Whatever agreements existed before her marriage are no longer valid. Pike's mask finally slipped completely. She belongs to me. I found her first. She was mine first. Nobody belongs to anybody, Willa said, stepping forward. Her voice carried a strength that made everyone present turn to look at her. I left Cedar Ridge because you could not accept that a woman has a right to say no. You tried to force me into marriage, and when I refused, you made my life hell until my father, and I had to flee. You are lying, Pike said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Willa pulled back her sleeve, showing her forearms faded but still visible scars. These are from a night you decided to show me what would happen if I did not obey. That is when I knew I had to leave. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the burning barn. Sheriff Henderson's expression had grown very serious. Pike, you and your men are going to leave this county and not come back. If I see you on this side of the territorial line again, I will arrest you for harassment and destruction of property. As Pike and his companions rode away, defeated, Willa finally lowered her rifle. Ezekiel saw tears streaming down her face, but for the first time since he'd known her, they seemed to be tears of relief rather than pain. It is over, she whispered. Magnolia dismounted and put her arms around Willa, offering the comfort of sisterhood. Ezekiel watched his 2 wives console each other and felt something shift permanently in his chest. This was not the business arrangement Sterling Maddox had crafted. This was a family forged not by law or money, but by the choice to stand together when it mattered most. In the month that followed, the 3 of them built something unprecedented in their small town. Willa moved the ranch, bringing her livestock and her hard-won independence. Magnolia spent her time assisting her father and building a house with them. The town eventually stopped staring and started accepting that some families are built on foundations stronger than convention. Ezekiel had entered into marriage expecting survival. Instead, he found something far more valuable. Two remarkable women who had taught him that love is not always what you expect, but it is always worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Do not forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.